Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Ben Cahill. I'm a Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. And today's a real treat for me. I am really pleased to welcome Fereidun Fesharaki back to CSIS. Fereidun is a longtime affiliate of our program. He's been a frequent guest at CSIS over the years. He is founder and chairman of FGE, a global consulting firm. And if you work in global oil and gas, you know Fereidun. He's one of the rare energy analysts with deep expertise on both global oil and gas and LNG markets. His company has strong roots in Southeast Asia, but really extensive relationships and business with companies and extensive contacts with policymakers right across the Middle East and Asia. His company specializes in East of Suez or Middle East to Asia trade. And I've always thought of Fereidun as someone who really captures the energy security and economic realities of Asia so well. So yesterday I revisited a talk that you gave at CSIS in 2014, where you described the oil and gas production boom that was happening in the United States and started to point to some of the export implications and this huge wave of US hydrocarbon exports that was coming. And in a way, I think the US is still adjusting to this newfound status. Policymakers are still kind of catching up. But when I looked at that talk, I thought this is a great example of really your ability to look ahead and see what's coming in the markets. So lots to talk about today. I think we're going to talk about both global oil and gas and LNG issues, and maybe we'll start with oil. But first, Fereidun, thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to see you. So let's talk about the oil market first. Maybe we can just start with a broad view of where we are. You know, last year we saw tremendous growth in oil demand around the world. I think about 2.4 million barrels a day of growth, something like 2/3 of that in China alone. This year the picture looks a little bit different. When you look back at the first half, what did you see in the market?
Well, the most important change between this year and last year is that the COVID recovery is over. And from China's big demand growth last year, majority of it was COVID recovery. So this year, we estimate 1.4, 1.5 million barrels per day of demand growth. Next year is 1.1, 1.2. On an average year, a good demand growth is about 1.2. So we've had better than average performance. But one of the most dramatic changes is the change of demand in China. The Chinese demand is going to peak by 2027-28. Gasoline demand will peak by the end of this year, early next year. Then diesel demand will peak right after that. But the whole system peaks before 2028. For the past 20 years, the oil market is always waiting for China to come in and rescue the market. That is now permanently gone. It's a very, very big difference in the structure.
Wow. So when you break apart those components of demand by product, can you talk about what you're seeing in terms of gasoline and diesel demand versus some of the other fuels that might be more affected by this economic slowing that we've seen in China and the problems in the construction sector? Can you disaggregate things a little bit?
Yes, well, the gasoline is being killed by the EVs. EVs are now 30-35% of the total fleet. It is remarkable if you visit China now, all the taxis, all the Uber type things are all EVs. Very comfortable, very luxurious cars for under $20,000, and I'm sure they are not subsidized. They may have been subsidized in the beginning for the capacity building, but today they pay their way. Naphtha demand continues to grow, and because of the petrochemical sector, so that's always there. Jet fuel still has growth prospects. But the industrial sector weakening and the property sector weakening has had a big impact on diesel demand. And this is why I think diesel demand is going to peak also within the next 12 months. And then they go down and other parts of the barrel goes up, but the net would be 0 to negative in 2 or 3 years from now.
Yeah. I want to talk about short-term market issues in a minute, but if you could expand on this issue of what happens after this Chinese demand starts to taper. I mean, as you said, China's really been the engine of global oil demand growth for decades now, especially in the 2000s and 2010s when you had this incredible economic growth rates. So where's the growth going to come from in the global market if it's not China?
Well, there is no easy substitutes. You know, India is a 250, 300,000 barrels per day growth market. It's pretty significant, but it doesn't have the prospects of getting the level that China was like last year, 2.4, 2.5 million barrels per day.
Yeah.
That kind of thing is not going to happen in India. So much of it has to come from the Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And also still growth in the Middle East is possible. But the sort of the big ramp up of demand, 2-3 million barrels per day demand, those things are now gone. And I think this shows a very fundamental change in the structure of the oil demand and supply balances.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really significant shift. And of course, we've seen in the last several years that, at least until this year, U.S. shale growth continues to outpace expectations. We've had really robust non-OPEC supply growth from the U.S., a little bit from Canada and Guyana and Brazil. I mean, do you expect that to continue? Do you think we'll still have that kind of robust non-OPEC supply?
I think another 2-3 years, 4 years, yes.
Yeah.
And you know, when we look at the U.S., we see growth of 500,000 barrels per day, roughly, excluding NGLs. So there is no 1 million, 2 million barrels per day the way that we used to see it in the U.S. anymore. Yeah. But I think another few years of growth and then slow down. The key issue is that inside of OPEC Plus, there is no big room for growth anymore. Basically, they either have run out of steam, or they've decided they don't want to invest anymore. So all this growth is going to come from outside of OPEC Plus, and still there is enough coming out. So we estimate that the 6 or 7 million barrels per day more demand is going to be seen before we peak, and we can find that 6-7 million barrels per day among the countries that you just listed. Yeah, there is enough there to support that. Yeah. But once this goes out, will it continue in other areas as such? I doubt that very much. I think oil demand peaks and oil supply peaks maybe 5 years after that. Yeah. So these things do not result in a scenario that suddenly oil demand stops growing, but oil supply keeps growing and the prices will collapse. We don't see that. Yeah.
That picture that you're painting of the market in OPEC Plus there's some pretty significant implications there. I mean, to take a step back, we had pretty deep production cuts that OPEC put in place starting in 2022 at the end of the year, right? 2.2 million barrels a day, I think, in headline cuts, and then a series of additional voluntary cuts since then. And I think that basically because of non-OPEC growth, they haven't been able to add those barrels back into the market. Yes. And of course, we had this agreement last month. The group-wide cuts for OPEC Plus were extended. The voluntary cuts have this schedule where they're supposed to be phased out, and those barrels will be added back into the market. It sounds like you're saying there's not a whole lot of room to add them back in.
That's right. You know, I mean, of course, they don't promise to add it back. They say that they will add it back if the circumstances are right. But it is possible that we don't get to add in anything back. Yeah. Or you add some volume and then you watch the market. If the prices are reflecting badly on these additions, then you hold back. Yeah. Basically, it's going to be a trial and error situation. No guarantees that any volumes will actually come back. And for next year, there is no room to bring anything back. Next year, the demand growth will be slower, and the prices will be lower than they are this year, for sure.
Wow. So that's got some pretty significant implications for fiscal balances and the revenue that's going to come for all these OPEC Plus states. Everyone speculates about what price these countries need. Of course, they don't really need that price, but that does suggest that, you know, some of the Gulf producers might be under a little bit of pressure, Gulf economies, as a result of, you know, lower for longer prices. Does that sound correct to you?
Yes. And selling stocks of Aramco is one way of having an additional revenue come in. Yeah. And it is having your cake in front of you, that you still keep the control on it.
Yeah.
And you still control everything yourself. So, so this is, I think, the way they look at it now. In places like Abu Dhabi, they don't put for sale the whole company.
Yep.
They put infrastructure. And a huge amount of money has been collected from that. Huge
Definitely.
amount.
You can sell off bits and pieces of
Bits and
the
pieces
fuel distribution company, gas pipelines, oil pipelines.
Again, you have your cake and eat it too, sort of, This is keeping more than 50% control. And I think that Saudi Arabia is a bit of an exception, that the oil under the ground is also part of the sale process in the shares. But in other countries, it's all infrastructure only. But these are ways to raise money. And of course, we need to keep in mind that if OPEC had not cut back 6 million barrels per day, where would the price of oil be today? Probably 40, 45, 50. So they have managed this process very well. And if the demand really takes a hiccup, the challenge would be very, very tough.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, this band that we seem to be stuck in recently between, say, $78, $85 a barrel for Brent, it's not really a bad price for both producers and consumers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Next year, we think it's going to be at the low end, mid-70s. But this year, it still has room to go up.
Yeah. Can we talk about refined products for a minute?
Sure.
So in China, we've seen a huge build out of refining and especially petrochemicals capacity. It sounds like you're saying demand in China is not flat, but growing much more slowly. So what does that imply for refinery margins and balances in Asia and elsewhere?
Well, that's a very good question. By the time the Chinese demand peaks, and even with the plans in China to shut down a lot of teapot refineries, they would still have about 1 million barrels per day of good quality refining capacity left over. So they have two choices. Either you produce them and export them, import and export, or you just don't run them. And these decisions are only made by President Xi Jinping. Of course, our clients in China, which are the oil companies, they all want to import and export because they have good quality refineries. But it's not clear. Our best guess is that they probably will not allow big exports because the supply inside of China is more important. And the official excuse is that we don't want to increase our carbon footprint by importing and exporting. But the energy security inside of China is very important.
Yeah. Let's talk about geopolitics for a minute. So since October, there's been a lot of turmoil in the Middle East with the attacks on Israel and then the terrible war and suffering in Gaza. And yet the market has not really been affected by this. Just little blips where the price has gone up and reacted to short-term news. But so far the market seems to be shrugging this off and saying, unless there's a real material supply disruption, it's not really going to affect prices. And if we take a step back a bit farther, we're only a couple years on from the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. There's been tremendous changes in the global oil market and product market, but it seems like the market has actually adapted and accommodated all these things pretty well. I'm curious what you make of that, this sort of eternal debate about whether or not there's a so-called geopolitical risk premium in the market. And maybe, if the market is absorbing geopolitical risk in new ways because of new technology and data that we have, what do you make of this?
I think the number one issue is OPEC plus excess capacity. Yeah. The market looks and says there's 6 million barrels per day of oil sitting there. Right. So if we lose 1 million barrels per day, the Saudis just can make it up, or Emiratis just make it up. So until we have that volume brought back in the market, the geopolitical risk is mitigated significantly. Maybe $2, $3, maximum $5 in it. But there will be no scenario that if something dramatic happens, so then the prices go to $150 a barrel. That cannot happen while you have this big burden of the surplus capacity
Yeah.
on top of you.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about the demand forecast and kind of the uncertainty in the market. One trend that we've seen in the last year or so is that the forecasts of the IEA and OPEC are really starting to diverge in a huge way. I mean, compared to historical norms, there's a big delta between those two forecasts. And of course, there's a bit of bad blood between these organizations, some tension between the two. What do you make of this? Is it a problem for forecasters and people in the market that we have these demand numbers, which are quite different and have different assumptions?
Well, I mean, everybody talks their book. So IEA, every month, they reduce the demand growth. And at the end of the year, they would add it in. The numbers for the annual numbers don't matter, but in a monthly basis, it makes a big difference because it increases the pessimism in the market and worry that the prices cannot hold. OPEC, on the other hand, says that the demand keeps growing as before, and in fact, transport fuels will grow by several million barrels per day, which is their job. And our job is to be in between and try to be fair. But if I want to add, compare the two sides together, I think OPEC ends up to be more accurate than IEA.
Okay. Maybe one more question for me on oil markets before we pivot to gas. We just had an election in Iran, which produced a surprise. Last year, I think one of the big surprises in the oil market was there was big growth in production and oil exports from Iran. In fact, outside the US, I think Iran was the single biggest added volume to the market. Are there any political or supply implications of this election result in Iran? What do you make of it?
Well, again, it's all up to the US elections. And Trump is unpredictable. He may come and make a deal and says, I made the deal. He likes to be a deal maker. But definitely the volume of exports have significantly gone up under the Biden administration. Basically, Biden administration turned a blind eye. The Chinese statistics show you there are no imports from Iran. But the imports from Malaysia are 1 million barrels per day, although Malaysia only produces 400,000 barrels per day.
Right.
So Malaysian numbers, some of Omani numbers are hidden. Everybody knows it, but it seems to be okay by the Biden administration because that keeps a lid on the price, which is good for the election purposes. But as of today, the new president in Iran, I think, is going to try to reach an agreement, a nuclear agreement with Biden administration before the end of his administration. And probably something by the early next year would be available. How much more can they produce? Maybe 300,000-400,000 barrels per day. But much of what they could produce, they've already produced.
Yeah. So not much farther to run. Interesting.
If Trump is the president, that could be all different. But Trump cannot impose the same kind of sanctions as he did before because the Iranians have found all ways of exporting in a roundabout ways. So it may cut back a few 100,000 barrels per day, but it won't be going back to the levels it used to be.
Got it. All right, let's pivot to LNG. Maybe just to start, a very broad question. What are you seeing in the market? Things seem to be kind of finely balanced but settled. We saw the panic subside after that dramatic price run-up that we saw starting in late 2021, 2022. Inventory levels in Europe seem pretty healthy. It's been a bit of an uptick in short-term or spot prices in Asia and Europe. What are you seeing in the LNG market today?
Well, the LNG market is waiting for a big shock, and the shock is the 2026-27 shock, where the supply side increases by 50%. If I told you that OPEC, or the oil production, will go up by 50 million barrels per day, then it would be mayhem. So this is a very similar environment. These volumes will come in. We think the spot prices can drop 60% in 18 months. So very dramatic and very soon in front of us. starting from late 25, begin to fall. Then as soon as the spot prices go down to below $5 a million BTU, then US production will begin to shut in. US production shut in this time is different from 2021 because US is such a huge player in the international market. It can have a very dramatic supply impact. So the US production is shut in and then the prices jump. Then when the prices are lower, South Asian countries, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and even China will rush and try to buy. So you have demand creation.
Yeah.
So the prices may be oscillating between $4 and $10 back and forth from 26 to 2031, 32. So very dramatic changes.
Yeah.
They have no OPEC to take care of the environment, so they would suffer.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big amount of volatility in spot. I mean, that leads me to another question about a shift we've seen in the market in the last couple of years, which is the rise of the portfolio players or aggregators. You know, in the United States and in other countries, these guys make up a big chunk of the offtake agreements, right? So you have a lot of volumes that have a buyer, but they don't really have an end user or destination. It's a more fluid market. Do you think this is the kind of market that can accommodate that kind of price volatility you're talking about? And are people comfortable having more spot exposure versus long-term?
I think in the big buyers in Asia, there's still going to be 80% term contracts.
Yeah.
Term contracts either from US or from other places, but long-term contracts, 15, 20 years and longer. It's interesting that some of the biggest US producers of gas, like Chevron and Exxon, they don't want to make LNG in the US. Reason is very simple. It's because in the US there is no money. The rate of return is very low. It's an added cost environment, and only the liquefaction pays you. And because of the competition, liquefaction costs have come down quite a bit. So the reason that these countries, these companies want to be buyer rather than a producer in the US is that they want to buy it and sell it on oil indexed. They don't want to sell it on a spot basis.
Yeah.
They think there is a price differential between oil indexation and hub indexation that they want to capture.
Yeah.
And we think that is going to become bigger and bigger. Substantial amount of LNG as off-taker being taken by the IOCs, both in the US and outside the US, non-US companies, but amounts are substantial.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one mega LNG producer, which has always stuck to long-term oil-linked pricing, is Qatar. So Qatar's in the midst of this huge capacity expansion in multiple phases. They still have a lot of LNG to market in terms of expiring contracts, but especially with this huge build-out. Where will they be in the next couple of years with this huge increase in potential oversupply?
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, I talk to them often. They don't seem worried. I seem worried because I add the numbers, but they don't seem worried. But everybody has an eye on something going wrong in a big way between US and China. Either the Chinese invade Taiwan or some big political distress between the two countries and the flows of gas stops. If that stops, then there's only one supplier in the market. That's the Qataris. There's nobody else. Because this market is dominated by two big suppliers and one big buyer. What the Chinese did for the oil market for the past 20 years, they will do for the LNG market for the next 20 years. And they will be key players in that market. But I think there is a probability that if that happens, then some of these contracts will not take place and they will buy from the Qataris instead.
That's really interesting. So I think some of your data showed that China's return to that 2021 LNG demand number, it'll be hard to get back there. One thing that I've been noticing is that China's role in the LNG market seems to be shifting to more of a balancing role, right? They've got so much regasification capacity, storage capacity. The Chinese NOCs are opening up trading desks. So China's role is not just a buyer, it's more of an integrated player, right?
Absolutely. China is the only country which has the ability to be a major or at least medium-sized exporter of LNG. And I think that if you look at the last few years' numbers, these numbers are picking up. And it's going to be more of the same. So China will be truly a global player as a buyer and as a seller.
Yeah. Well, you're here in Washington. There's been a lot of debate about the LNG export industry with the pause that was declared in late January. We've written a lot about that at CSIS. The way that I framed it in my own writing is that, policymakers are just catching up with the status that the U.S. as a huge energy exporter, crude oil, petroleum products, NGLs, and LNG. And there's been a debate about the need for continued investment in fossil fuels, including big mega projects over the long term, even as we have mid-century net zero goals and decarbonization. But there's still a pretty robust debate going on about the merits of being a big LNG exporter. So can you just talk about the LNG export pause, the impact on the market? Is it going to be lasting? What do you think about the debate?
Well, this pause is really bad for some people. Let's say take a project like CP2, 9.3 million ton is already sold, ready to go. And by waiting, costs go up. They may not be able to keep the customers. But in the scheme of things, this big surplus, it gets spread. So may not be that bad in the scheme of things, while it's really bad for some players. 90 million tons of additional FIDs were supposed to come, of which 50 million tons was the US. And this 50 million ton is going to be taking a pause and coming later on. The market assumption is that by middle to late of 25, no matter who is the president, this will come.
Yeah.
But it does spread the surplus a little bit around and makes it a little bit more easy to tolerate.
Yeah. So there's always boom and bust periods in terms of final investment decisions on LNG projects. We saw a boom in 2023 with a lot of FIDs around the world. This year is pretty slow, but it sounds like you're saying this will just get pushed out a little bit.
Right, but I mean, we're still looking in 2025, another 40, 50 million tons of FIDs outside the US.
Yeah.
So it still is coming. It's coming. So the US would have been an extra 40, 50 on top of it. And not being there is not a disaster.
Yeah, okay. Can you talk briefly about the long-term LNG demand outlook? What are you seeing, say, post-2030, especially in Asia?
Well, we are among the camp that we believe that 700 million tons of global LNG is still the right number. And that the demand will grow until mid-2040s and then will be flat. But one thing with LNG, which is different from everything else, LNG is an insurance policy for making mistakes. Many countries make mistakes in the energy mix, and then when they make a mistake, then LNG comes to the rescue.
Yeah.
And this is always keeping LNG in business and in place, simply because it's an insurance policy. But the demand growth, we are very bullish. Oil demand stops, but the LNG demand continues, and then it doesn't fall, it becomes flat. And from that, if you look at that volume, 700 million, Qatar will be about 140 million tons, and the US would be about 250 to 300 million tons.
Yeah.
So these two big players will make up most of the supply in the world.
Wow.
But the US will always be number one in LNG exports.
We're coming close to the end of the time, but I want to ask one final question, which is about energy security. You spend a lot of time with clients, companies across Asia. I wonder what you can tell us about perspectives on energy security and the long-term role of gas and LNG. What should people in Washington understand about how Asian perspectives on energy security and gas are different?
Yes, I think that what is important to note is that in Asia, number one issue is energy security. The issues with climate change in Japan, Korea, and Australia, which are specifically focused on this area, are still very important, but secondary. But in many, many countries in Asia, climate change issues are important but marginal issues. Number one is energy security, and what happened with Ukraine and Russia really brought that to the fore, and they are now convinced that they have to focus on energy security.
Yeah, I was in Japan a couple of weeks ago and met with a lot of Japanese companies and some government agencies, and that message came through loud and clear.
Yes, indeed.
Well, Fereidun, this was fantastic. Thank you so
very
much.
for
As
having
usual,
me.
your ability to cover a very broad landscape is really impressive. So really grateful that you spent time
Thank
with
you.
us. And thank you to our online audience for joining us today. Really appreciate everyone's time. This is Ben Cahill signing off, and we'll see you soon at another event.